For many people, cooking can be very frustrating and cause great deal of stress. Usually, there is a reason behind it, and it's either lack of understanding of the processes during cooking or previous failures, especially if you don't know why it all went wrong. What if I tell you that I have a simple solution that can greatly reduce your stress level when cooking and bring back that joy you had? Well, to be perfectly honest, I do. Just watch this video. Welcome to Yummy and Nerdy. For those who don't know me, my name is Simon, and today I would like to invite you all to watch the very first episode of my own compendium of culinary knowledge, which has never been done so extensively, at least not for free. Today we will talk about one of the most important topics, although often underestimated, which is heat treatment. It's pretty obvious that we wouldn't be where we are now if it wasn't for the fire. It was the heat treatment of food that increased its caloric value so much that the surplus of this energy was used to expand our brain, and from there, thanks to the snowball effect, we became who we are now. Okay, but this is not the historical channel, let alone anthropological one. So let's get down to business. So what is the heat treatment in the culinary aspect? It is a process that involves subjecting ingredients to temperature, resulting in a number of chemical reactions that improve taste and smell. In addition, reducing the risk of acute food poisoning. And on top of that, the mentioned before calorie increase. Maybe now we try to avoid the latter, but it is thanks to this ability that humanity has survived its worst moments. From a cooking perspective, the most important reactions that we are going to look at today are protein denaturation, Maillard reaction, and caramelization. And maybe starch gelatinization a bit. It may sound scientific and extremely boring, but I assure you that these are the only appearances, and I also guarantee that the knowledge just from this episode alone will help you not only to cook better, but also allow you to find and eliminate the mistakes that have caused you to fail in the past. First, I will try to explain the meaning of individual terms, and then we will move on to discussing what happens when we expose food to heat. Let's start with the protein denaturation and why is it important. And for example, because the denaturation of certain proteins in meat makes it hard, and we obviously don't want that. Either way, proteins, in order to perform their functions in the body, must have a specific structure, which is made up of amino acids connected in a strictly defined way. If the above structure changes under the influence of temperature or chemical compounds, such as acids for instance, then the protein ceases to perform its function, and this irreversible change is called denaturation. It is worth mentioning that the temperature range which protein's denaturation occurs, it's quite narrow, from about 50 degrees to 70 degrees Celsius. They have a greatest impact when processing fish, meat, or for example eggs, but there will be a separate episode about eggs. The second type of reaction I mentioned is the Maillard reaction, or rather a set of reactions between amino acids and reducing sugars under the influence of temperature. It is a non-enzymatic darkening process, but does way more than that. During those reactions, hundreds of different new compounds are being formed, which, in addition of giving the dish the color, also it changes its taste and smell. From a culinary point of view, we can assume that it becomes noticeable around 155 degrees Celsius. Next process is called caramelization. It's also a non-enzymatic darkening of the product, but it's caused by subjecting sugars to high temperatures. Cooking can be described as a process by which the initial ingredients undergo transformations, change their properties, resulting in the formation of the final product. And this process and transformation are nothing more than just chemistry and physics. And even basic knowledge in this subject is necessary to determine the impact on the final result. which is obviously the dish we try to cook. But this is not the only advantage. Thanks to the knowledge of the chemical reactions and their impact on the properties of the product, we are able to find a reason why our dish did not turn out as we would like. Do you know how much frustration, fruitless attempts, wasted time and products this knowledge can save? And all you have to do is stay till the end. Heat treatment in cooking is nothing more than subjecting the product to heat, which is directly related to the increase of its own temperature. And what happens when this temperature rises? Not much at first. Well, maybe bacteria grow faster, but no one is going to heat the chicken to 40 degrees and just keep it like it is for hours, right? Exactly. The influence of temperature on the properties of the product is one thing, and the prevention of bacterial growth is another thing. And, of course, we will talk about that too, so stay with me. But let's focus on the temperature. We will talk today about temperatures that are significant to us from the cooking perspective. As I mentioned earlier, the temperature range at which protein denaturation occurs is very narrow, so it shouldn't surprise you that we will start with that. The protein that denatures first is myosin. Although this process starts around 40 degrees Celsius, we are really only interested in 50 degrees. This is when myosin rapidly denatures. Studies on taste preferences have shown that people like meat with denatured myosin much better. So the first conclusion is that the temperature of fish and other meat, when heat treated, should be at least 50 degrees Celsius, which is the temperature of a rare steak. Interestingly, in animals living in hot climates, myosin denatures at slightly higher temperatures. With the increase in temperature, in addition to myosin denaturation, there is a loss of water and fat rendering, and to some extent a denaturation of collagen, which at this stage adds, unfortunately, a rubbery texture to the meat. At 60 degrees, there is also a certain very important change that will definitely please opponents of this bloody appearance of meat. Myoglobin, a type of muscle protein, changes its color from red to translucent, causing the meat and its juices to turn grayish. I wonder if calling a steak rare has anything to do with that. Let's take this opportunity to put an end once and for all to the myth that the red liquid leaking from the meat is blood. These are the same juices that we like so much in meat, only with myoglobin still red, which is just a protein. So hit the like button if you know someone who doesn't eat steaks just because there's a blood oozing from them. Another temperature worth remembering is 62 degrees, which is the temperature at which the whites in the egg begins to curdle. What happens if we continue to increase the temperature? Well, around 65 degrees Celsius, actin, another protein found in meat, will be denatured, which drastically affects the taste sensation, and it's mainly responsible for the hardening of muscle fibers and loss of moisture in cooked meat due to shrinking these protein fibers, and actually they're pushing the water out. In other words, when it happens, you're done. Unless your meat has a lot of collagen and fat and you plan it to cook it longer, like stewing for example, but that's gonna be later during this video. So your last resort may be to leave your meat to rest. While there is no chance for actin to relax, myosin will a little, additionally absorbing some of the lost water. But it is better to stick to one rule: myosin denatured, actin intact, and you'll be fine. So how do you like it so far? Do you think this knowledge will be useful to you? If so, click like button, and if you want more, remember to subscribe to my channel. It doesn't cost you anything, and for me, it's like a rocket fuel. So far, we covered the temperatures which the preparation of meat usually ends. The exception will be those fatty pieces with a high collagen content, and that is where it becomes a slightly more complicated. But simply because collagen comes in different forms. You have the clearly visible version like tendons, membranes, etc., which is best to just cut off, cut out and throw away. And the invisible one, located inside the muscles. As if that wasn't enough, denatured collagen becomes rubbery at temperature around 68 degrees, and for squid is even 35, but already at 70 to 80 degrees, if we give it enough time, it will hydrolyze and partially turn into gelatin. When collagen does that, nothing will hold those individual fibers, and thus we will get this flaky meat coming right off the bones, which can be easily teared into individual fibers, like, pulled pork or well-baked ribs and barbecue sauce. So far, we've only dealt with meat, but what about vegetables? Unlike meat, they do not contain high amounts of protein, but they have something else, and that is starches, sugars, and fiber. Heat treatment does not really affect fiber because the nibble is quite resistant to it, but it does affect sugars and also starches. As most of the starch gelatinizes, in other words, becomes digestible at the temperature about 80 to 88 degrees Celsius, starchy vegetables are cooked at the temperature between 90 and 99, which increases their digestibility. An interesting fact, raw starch has a crystalline form and it is not digestible at all, but after cooking it swells up with water and in that form can be broken down to glucose in our small intestine. But if we cool such a starch, it will give up some of that water and crystallize again, becoming resistant starch, otherwise known as retrograded, and will reduce the caloric value of the product. And despite internet myth, such a process is reversible, but only at a temperature of 150-170 degrees Celsius. So go ahead and reheat those potatoes from the previous day. Every diabetic probably knows this, but if they don't, it is worth looking into. So far, we talked about the temperature inside the product. But in the aspect of heat treatment, the temperature on the surface is equally important. And what is happening on the surface that is so important? Well, obviously, we'll start with one of the tastiest reactions that occurs on the surface, the famous Maillard reaction. Despite the fact that it occurs even in relatively low temperature, does it extremely slowly. So, for the purpose of cooking, we can safely assume that it becomes visible and significant only from the temperature about 150 degrees Celsius. If you want to know the story of how it was discovered and all the details, there is a lot of information on the internet. For today, we will talk about the impact of these reactions on food and how to use it in practice. Thanks to the Maillard reaction, or rather a series of reactions, hundreds of new compounds are created, which gives the dish a beautiful color, improves its taste and texture, such as crispy brown crust and the wonderful smell of freshly baked bread. And now it is time for fun fact. Do you know why we actually sear? If you wanted to say that the reason is to close the pores and keep the juices inside, then no. This is just a myth, and scientists prove the theory wrong. So why do we sear? Well, exactly to be able to get the effect caused by the Maillard reaction, which couldn't take place when you, for example, stew, since due to the presence of a large amount of water, makes it impossible to reach the right temperatures. After all, water boils at 100 degrees, and as we discussed before, 155 or more is needed for that Maillard reaction to occur. An interesting fact, why do we boil in water but deep fry in oil? It's simple. The water is wet and the oil is not, despite the fact that both are liquids. Another practical tip, Maillard reactions do not depend only on temperature. It turns out the products with a higher amount of alkaline compounds undergo Maillard reaction faster. The alkaline products are basically in almost every kitchen, like baking powder or baking soda. So you can make your bread, buns, dinner rolls darker just by brushing them with the baking soda solution. In the same way, adding baking soda to pancakes will speed up their darkening. So, for example, if you make your favorite pancake and they come out too pale, you can add a little bit more soda, and if they burn too fast, it may be worth, for example, reducing the amount of baking soda or baking powder if you don't use baking soda in the recipe. So you can see how simple knowledge can influence your final result. And now we turn up the heat all the way to 180 degrees Celsius. There's no denying that this is a quite popular temperature, especially when baking. And in a moment, I will explain why. In fact, it is very simple. It's all about caramelization of sugars. Different sugars caramelizing at different temperatures. Today, we discuss two basic sugars. Sucrose, the main component of regular white and brown sugar. The caramelization of this starts around 160-170 degrees Celsius. But how to use that theory in practice? Simple. A cake baked at 160 degrees darkens only slightly. In 180 degrees, way more, and additionally aroma also changes. And at 200 degrees, not only darkens significantly, but also much faster. So another sugar worth mentioning is fructose. As the name suggests, it is mostly found in fruits, but also in honey, a real honey, not that fake one. But why do you need this knowledge? Listen and be amazed, because this is important. For fructose, caramelization begins at 110 degrees. So if one day you will think of replacing sugars with honey in your recipe, be aware that it will burn, unless you lower the baking temperature significantly or add some wet ingredients, like the ones with a higher water content. Because as you know, water boils at 100 degrees, so before it evaporates, it will lower the temperature of the fructose, delaying its caramelization. Another mind-blowing tip is when you bake a cake with the wet fruits, put them on top. Dry fruits, it's better to mix in the dough. When we started talking about Maillard reactions or caramelization, we moved smoothly from the temperature inside the product to the temperature we apply to get desired inner temperature. And with that swift move, we went from chemistry to physics. Okay, now straight to the important bit. There are three mechanisms of heat transfer in gastronomy: conduction, convection, radiation. The simplest one and the easiest one to explain is conduction, because here heat is transferred as a result of a direct contact. To put it simply, it's basically frying. Another is convection, where heat is transferred through a material moving around another material. Here we have additional division into dry heating, like baking, toasting, and, as I mentioned earlier, deep frying, and wet heating, as you can probably guess, includes boiling, stewing, steaming. The third mechanism is radiation. Probably the microwave comes to mind right away. And that's great, but what probably doesn't come to your mind is grilling or toasting. Yeah, when grilling, red hot charcoals heats the product with infrared radiation. Of course, nothing in life is black and white. So, in fact, in most cases, we have a combination of several methods. During baking, we have three: convection, moving hot air, radiation from the heated oven walls, and conduction from contact with tray or container we baked in. Regardless of the methods of heat transfer, it is based on one universal principle. Everything in the world strives for equilibrium. A simple example: if you put a cold stone in a hot water, the water cools down and the stone heats up. But after enough time, both the water and the stone will have the same temperature. They will reach a temperature equilibrium. It is this pursuit of balance that is one of the most important factors in proper heat treatment. The second in line is the speed of this phenomenon. And this speed depends on the temperature difference between one element and another. To put it simply, the higher the applied temperature, the faster we will get the finished product. But if it was that simple, I wouldn't be making this video and your steak would always come out perfect. But unfortunately, as it is in real life, everything is a touch more complicated. One of the elements that complicates the heat treatment is the temperature gradient. In other words, the difference between the temperature on the outer and the inner layers of the heated product. The difference is caused by the fact that we supply heat energy from the outside, and the transfer of this energy has its own pace and doesn't happen instantaneously. The rule of thumb is that the higher the difference between applied temperature and the temperature of the product being heated, the greater the gradient will be. Let's take a steak as an example and assume that we like it to be 57 degrees in the middle. It would be ideal to have 57 all the way through, but that's not possible with regular methods, at least. In the outer layers, the temperature can be as high as 70 degrees. And imagine that you take such a steak out, straight off the pan, measuring 57 degrees inside. You put it aside for 5 minutes to rest, cut it, and the steak is no longer rare. When you measure the temperature again, suddenly it reads 60 degrees. Well, as I said before, everything in the universe tends to equalize. So if the temperature in the outer layers were higher than the one inside, then according to this principle, it had to even out, or at least come close to it based the time given. So the outer layer probably cooled down a touch, and the inner layer warmed up. The same principle applies to roast fish and every pastry or eggs. So a little tip, regardless of you frying or you baking or roasting, take your product before it reaches the desired temperature. The rule of thumb for a steak is roughly 3 degrees. So if you're striving for 54 degrees inside, take it out when hitting 51. And here we come to another very important piece of advice. Buy yourself a meat thermometer. You don't even realize how much easier it is to control the temperature and the final result. The method of heat transfer is important, but there is one more thing to consider: thermal conduction. Air copes with this much worse than water or oil, and certainly worse than steel, aluminum, or cast iron. Try putting chicken in the oven at 100 degrees and in a pot with boiling water, same temperature. Which one will reach desired temperature first? So you know now how the heat transfer, you know a difference between various methods. So you should be able to predict the final results using just 4 variables, like time, temperature, type of heat carrier, and the way it is transferred. So if you want to achieve a specific effect, you just need to match the above mentioned elements accordingly. For example, roasting chicken. You'll like it when it's juicy inside, right? But at the same time, has that wonderful crispy dark brown skin. If you set temperature too high, by the time temperature inside reaches the safe value, it will already be dry in the outer layers and the skin will most likely burn. If you set your temperature to lower one, the chicken will be soft, moist, juicy, and the meat will come off the bone beautifully. But it will most likely have this quite pale exterior with what you can call it unappealing look. So in this case, the best approach would be to set your oven to convection combined with the grill. But what if we don't have such an oven? We have to break our process into 2 stages. The first one at the lower temperature so that our chicken cooks inside, and the second one with a much higher temperature to get that nice brown crispy skin. You know, in the first stage, we can even add water every now and then. That increased humidity from the evaporating liquid will not only speed up the baking process, since water is much better heat conductor, but it will also prevent the chicken from losing its own water. The same principle applies when you, for example, try to make a stew. You want the meat to be soft and melt in your mouth kind of thing, right? But at the same time, you want it to be rich in flavor. All you really need is knowledge from this episode alone to make it happen. First of all, choosing the meat. You need to choose the one rich in collagen, so those cheaper cuts, preferably even more fatty. Secondly, sear the meat first, because what you want is that Maillard reaction to take place. You also know that stewing will cause meat to reach temperatures high enough for actin to denature. To use that high collagen content to your advantage, all you need to do is to stew temperature above 80 degrees long enough for all that collagen to gelatinize. Just coat the meat in the flour before frying and you're golden. This increases the flavor profile and simplifies the process of thickening the stew. That's it, pretty simple, right? If you think so too, click and subscribe. The last but not least is food safety. Heating is one of the easiest ways to minimize the chances of serious food poisoning. That and hygiene, of course. Bacteria, parasites and their eggs are in many products that you would not suspect. As far as everyone knows, poultry, raw fish or eggs are products that should be handled with caution. But I guess no one really suspects flour, right? Let me explain. What is flour made of? Well, from grain. And where does the grain grow? On the field. And what is on the field? Animal poop and piss. Anyway, before such grain is delivered and transformed into flour, plenty of mice and rats will use it as a dining room and a toilet at the same time. In short, we have a fecal bacteria E. coli present in the raw flour. You don't believe me? Read the results of a research and test carried out after a frozen pizza scandal produced by a very popular Swiss company. But that's for another time. Today, let us focus on how to heat up your food in a safe manner. Have you all heard about keeping your food outside of the danger zone, which is between 4 and 60 degrees Celsius, of course? The reason for it is that pathogenic microorganisms multiply the fastest in that range, and this is the temperature range in which products susceptible to colonization by bacteria should be kept as brief as possible. To make things easier, they say 4 hours, or even safer version says 2 hours. This is a maximum time for food to be kept within the 4 and 60 degrees. So you take a fish out of the fridge in the store, takes you 30 minutes to get home, then you only have 3.5 hours left, right? Remember, that time includes heating it to a safe temperature. So we are constantly talking about 60 degrees, and everyone has heard that the inner temperature of a chicken must be 74 degrees, right? Anybody knows why? It's pretty simple. It's just to be on the safe side. That's it. It takes few things into account. Not all thermometers are accurate. You can also stick it in the wrong spot, and the measurements may be biased because of that. And 74 is the temperature at which salmonella will die instantly. But that doesn't mean that during the heat treatment process it didn't die much earlier. Imagine that this is the same with bacteria, as for example with people who are left in the middle of the desert without water. After all, it's not like on the third day at 8:15 everyone just drops dead. Well, one is stronger, will last longer, another one will die right away. And it's the same with bacteria. That is, the process of killing microorganisms depends on the temperature and takes less time the higher the temperature is. So in practice, the idea is to reduce the amount of pathogenic bacteria in food to a level where they no longer pose a threat. In this case, why is everyone trumpeting that it is best to heat your steak or fish to temperatures at which these bacteria can still be dangerous? There is also a simple explanation here. Poultry, here the matter is simple. The problem is bacteria is found also inside the meat, not only on the exterior. So in this case, we have to strictly stick to the temperatures at which we are sure that the bacteria inside are no longer alive. But what about everything else, like fish, pork, beef, or even vegetables? In this case, the bacteria in most cases come from outside. Contaminated water, soil, bacteria in feces can contaminate those vegetables or meat, for example in a slaughterhouse. So we can assume that bacteria are present only on the surface of a given product. So if we cook a steak, for instance, despite of reaching internal temperature of 54 degrees, as you already know, the outside was subjected to a much higher temperature, one in which bacteria died immediately. So a rare steak with the nice crust, it's okay, but the raw one, not always. The same applies to fish. Maybe the temperature inside is indeed lower, but on the exterior was treated with a much higher temperature, so all the bacteria should be dead. With the fish there's a different problem, parasites, but that's another episode as well, so subscribe and maybe you won't miss it. So if you ever wonder why you can serve a medium rare hamburger in some countries and only well done in the other, well, now you know. Because you don't cook the meat for hamburger first and then grind it. but grind it together with the bacteria on the surface, and that makes bacteria present inside the meat as well. Theoretically, if all the safety and hygiene rules were followed, the risk is tiny, but your meat could be imported from other side of the world, and you have zero clue in what conditions it was slaughtered, stored, transported, and whether you are sure that the cold chain was preserved. How many times have you been in a supermarket or discount store and saw a whole pallet of raw meat in the room temperature just waiting to be put into fridge by a maybe not so eager staff, for example, or staff that's too busy? It could be your steak, your piece of meat that you want to grind later. I love medium rare burgers as much as the next guy, but I'll pass. Unless I make them using sous vide method. Why? I have already told you. Killing bacteria depends on time and temperature. So if we can keep the temperature at 60 degrees for like 35 minutes, we will kill all the bacteria without denaturing actin, which means we will retain more moisture and the meat will be softer and it will be safe to make them medium. One more quite important thing, as I said, our task is to reduce the amount of bacteria to a level that does not pose a threat to our health. But we're not always able to eliminate all of them. Additionally, we can transfer the bacteria from one product to the product we already processed with our hands or whatever, contaminated knife. Maybe there won't be enough of them to hurt us, but if we leave them long enough in that danger zone, that is, between 4 and 60, then if we are unlucky, that tiny colony of bacteria can multiply and create a colony big enough to cause some major damage. This is why it is so important that products, even after being cooked, that we do not want to eat immediately, should be cooled down as fast as possible and transferred to the fridge. And the fastest way to cool down doesn't mean leave them on a countertop. Put the container or pot with the leftover in icy water or at least as cold water as possible and then stick it to the fridge. Important advice. Rice grains contain Bacillus cereus, a bacteria which are quite resistant to temperature and their spores can survive boiling. Even an hour at room temperature of cooked rice can be enough to cause poisoning. So if you want to leave the rice for later, cooling it in ice water and putting it in the fridge, even when it's still warm, this is a minimum you can do. Despite the fact that most of the information in this episode, it's not some closely guarded secret, but knowledge generally available. It is often these basics that we forget, and in these basics that have the greatest impact on the level of our cooking. All you need to do is to watch this episode. No more tough steaks for you. So let me know in the comments what you found most interesting, what you found useful, and any other interesting facts about the temperature or heat treatment or even bacteria. Feel free to share them in the comments. Obviously, this is just the beginning, the first episode of many, so if you don't want to miss them, subscribe and hit notify. It's all for today. I hope that you had more fun today than during the chemistry lesson in school, and you will be happy to come back for more. And there will be a reason to come back, I can promise you that. Stay warm, but keep the actin intact.